and makes us American, and this is an issue that we should all be unified on. I want to just talk a little bit about the history of this provision and this practice in order to put the current controversy in perspective. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, and I remember what it was like prior to the Clean Water Act. The Cuyahoga River burned for a week with flames that were 8 stories high. Lake Erie was declared dead. I couldn't swim in the Potomac. I grew up in Washington, or the Charles, or the Hudson when I was a boy. And that accumulation of insults in 1970 drove 20 million Americans out onto the street on the first Earth Day, demanding that our political leaders return to the American people the ancient environmental rights that had been taken from us over the past 80 years. The political system responded, and it was a Republican, Richard Nixon, who created EPA and passed 28 major environmental laws were passed over the next decade as a result of Earth Day. The Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, CERCLA, RCRA, TSCRA, etc. But it was a Republican who passed the most important one and signed it into law, which was the Clean Water Act in 1972. And that act recognized the ancient law and the constitution of each state. It says, as Sam pointed out, waterways belong to the public. They're part of the commons. The constitution of every state in this country says that the waters and the fishes of that state belong to the people of that state. They don't belong to the coal company. They don't belong to the utility. They don't belong to the EPA administrator. They don't belong to the president or Congress. They belong to the people of the state. Every individual, every child, whether rich or poor, young or old, humble or noble, has an absolute right to walk down to that waterway and take out their share of the fish. And Congress recognized that. Both parties recognized that there was that the waters belong to the public, that there was no right to pollute. So they passed a law that said we're going to make pollution completely illegal. People recognized during the negotiation that pollution was part of the business model of American industry at that time. So they had to give the industry time to clean up. So the Clean Water Act said we're going to make every waterway swimmable and fishable by 1983, and that all pollution will be banned completely by 1985. By 85, there will be no more pollution left. The central mechanism for doing that was, and without bankrupting industry, was that EPA was ordered to develop and publish best management practices, best available technology for every industry. So the wool industry, the paper industry, the steel industry, coal mining, all of them, and regulations passed that said these are the standards at the best of your industry, that your industry has to use across the board, because these are available technologies that you ought to be using. So the technology that was being used at that time, and is still being used today, was not the best available technology. It was a 3,000-year-old technology called settling ponds. And EPA recognized that and began the regulatory process in the early days of the Reagan administration. But as many of you may remember, the Reagan administration, Reagan appointed Ann Gorsuch to run EPA, and she and 26 of her underlings were making sweetheart deals to protect the industries from regulations. They were all ended up being fired from EPA. Because of that, this industry was one of the most powerful industries in the country. And they were able to go in and derail the regulations that would have required them to dry process their coal ash. Obvious technology and the best available technology. Oh, and in 1997, this is 17 years later, FDA did a national study on America's fish, freshwater fish in this country, and found that every freshwater fish that they tested all across the country had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. So we're living today in a science fiction nightmare in this country, where my children, the children of most Americans, can no longer engage in the seminal primal activity of American youth, which is to go fishing with their father or mother on the local fishing hole and come home and safely eat the fish. And another 10 years pass, or 8 years, and the Sierra Club in 2010 sued EPA and said, it's time, you gotta pass these regulations. They won that lawsuit because the law 30 years ago had required it. So EPA then promulgated regulations. It takes EPA 5 to 8 years to promulgate a new regulation. They took 5 years to promulgate this one. In 2016, it was promulgated by the end of 2015, early 2016. But the way they wrote the regulation was that it didn't have to be implemented by all these utilities across the board. It was going to be integrated into the permit renewal process. So under the Clean Water Act, every discharger has to get a discharge permit. It's called a NIPDES permit. Those permits have to be renewed every 5 years. So at the end of that 5-year period, the EPA would issue them a new permit, which included this provision that they changed their wet processing process to dry processing. So this process has already begun. Many of these utilities, in fact, have already raised their rates to bill customers for this process. So the disruption of this process is going to create mayhem in the marketplace. Many utilities are already doing this. There's only 12% of the utilities of the electric generation facilities that are going to be affected by this, and the cost is rather minimal. The average cost, according to the utility's own declaration, is about $1.42 per year per customer. That's less than a half a cent a day for clean water. And this administration, of course, Sarah Coyne said they put the fox in charge of the hen house. I would say they put I would say they put the hen in charge of the fox house. The hen being Scott Pruitt, who's been carrying dirty water for the utilities and for corporate agriculture and the chemical industry during his entire career. His only qualification for this job as EPA chief was that he sued EPA 15 times. And he sent a signal, a very devious telling signal to the governors, this extraordinary letter before he did this revocation of this regulation. He sent a letter to the governors of this country encouraging them to abuse and encourage their utilities to violate the law, essentially saying, help is on the way. We're gonna get rid of this problem for you. And this is to me, this is criminal. And it ought to be criminal to everybody. It's not technically a crime because they've been able to subvert democracy. They've been able to corrupt public officials. They've been able to capture the agency that is supposed to protect Americans from pollution. This should have been illegal 30 years ago. And under the Clean Water Act, it technically is illegal. It's just we can't enforce it. The Clean Water Act said you had to get rid of all pollution by 1985. Oh, we can't enforce it because they refused to pass these regulations, to promulgate these regulations. A lot of people say, well, it's just an environmental crime. It's not a real crime. Environmental crime is real crime. And as Mary Ann had pointed out, people die from these pollutions. People are grievously injured. Children lose IQ, dramatic loss in IQ from exposure to both mercury and lead. They get cancer, and they die. and people lose jobs. I represent the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, the riverkeeper, for 33 years. And all the commercial fishermen on the Hudson I originally represented, a 300-year-old industry, are now out of work because of pollution. We can't catch the fish anymore. That's an act of theft. But imagine this: if you're a little girl born with a perfectly good brain, but during your natal period or immediately after, your mother ate fish from the local river, or you were fed fish from the local river, and you get mercury or lead into your body, and when you get to 5th grade, that little girl may not be able to read a book as easily as her classmates, or she may not be able to solve a math problem as easy as those classmates. And God gave that little girl the brain and the capacity to read that book and solve that math problem. With that utility, and EPA administrators, Scott Pruitt, took it away from her. And to me, that's one of the worst crimes that any human being can commit, because this little girl, you've compromised her life. You've constricted her ambitions, her aspirations, her imagination, her capacity to think, to contribute, to compete. And we're doing this. This is real. This is happening in this country today. And it's almost unimaginable to me that government could, and it ought to be unimaginable to all of us, that our government could get to this point where they put the profits of this industry ahead of the health of that little girl, of our children. And a lot of them will say, well, we believe in free market capitalism. But they don't believe in free markets. This is the opposite of free market capitalism. This is corporate crony capitalism. This is socialism for a very cushy, comfortable socialism for big, wealthy polluters, and a barbaric, savage capitalism for the rest of us, for those of us who have to live with pollution, for people from these communities whose children are being harmed. So, I would say to all of you and to EPA that this is what we're seeing here. It is an outrageous subversion of democracy and all the values that we cherish as a nation, and that we all ought to be revolted by it. And, Scott Pruitt is the hen guarding the fox house, but he's brought the fox in to do this dirty work. And the papers I noticed this morning, the legal papers that our Department of Justice has issued challenging this regulation, were signed by Jeffrey Wood. And Jeffrey Wood is one of the most notorious coal industry attorneys in this country. He's represented the worst polluter, Southern Company, for many years, and then a string of polluters before that. And I didn't know that he had moved to government. I suppose he was recruited for just this purpose, to dismantle the laws that protect Americans from pollution, protect Republican Americans and Democratic Americans and the children of every American. And everybody, whether you're Republican or Democrat, ought to be offended by what's happening with this regulation today. Thank you.
Well, we will all be testifying at 1 over at the EPA, but before we leave, we do have a little time for questions, if there are any.